A fake marriage to the alien queen concluded the war, but now she wants it to be real. The war between humanity and the Verax had been raging for years, and the death toll kept rising on both sides. The once strong nations of Earth had crumbled under the weight of constant battles, and the alien forces were no better off. Resources were dwindling, cities lay in ruins, and both sides had lost hope for a peaceful solution. Desperate for an end to the suffering, the United Earth government made a decision no one ever expected. The queen of the Verax, Elendra, was known for her strength and intelligence, and her people were not easy to defeat. Yet her empire, too, was on the brink of collapse. With both sides teetering on the edge, a diplomatic envoy was sent, carrying a proposal that would change everything. A marriage between Captain Ezra Vance, a decorated officer from Earth, and Queen Elendra herself. The announcement came as a shock to Ezra. He had seen the destruction caused by the Verax firsthand. His friends, his comrades, his family had all been torn apart by the relentless conflict. He had no love for the Verax, and the idea of marrying one of them seemed almost insulting. But the government's reasoning was simple. A marriage would symbolize unity, an unbreakable bond between the two species, and it would end the war. It would also allow both sides to focus on rebuilding, with a peace treaty that no one could ignore. The idea was outlandish, but it worked. Ezra's objections were ignored. He was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. And so, the wedding took place in a grand ceremony on the alien homeworld. The entire universe seemed to hold its breath as Captain Ezra Vance, clad in the finest uniform Earth could provide, walked down the aisle toward Elendra. The queen stood tall in her regal attire, her golden eyes glimmering with determination, her posture flawless. She was everything a queen should be, proud, strong, and unwavering. Yet beneath her composed exterior, Ezra could feel the weight of something unspoken. The exchange of vows was brief, almost clinical. There were no flowers, no music, and certainly no romance. It was a political maneuver, nothing more. The audience of leaders, soldiers, and diplomats clapped in approval as the marriage was sealed with a formal kiss. The war was over. The peace was in their hands. Ezra couldn't quite grasp it. Was it all really over? The war that had torn apart his life, his world, was it truly finished just like that? He felt the weight of the queen's kiss, but it was not one of passion. It was a symbol, a necessary sacrifice. After the ceremony, Ezra was escorted to the royal palace, where the two would now live as partners in peace. The palace was vast, a towering structure of silver and glass, filled with strange artwork and alien technology that Ezra had never seen before. The halls echoed with the sounds of footsteps and distant conversations in the alien language, which Ezra still struggled to understand. The queen's personal chambers were unlike anything he had imagined. There was a large bed with translucent silk sheets, a seating area surrounded by windows looking out into the alien city, and strange sculptures he couldn't begin to identify. Elendra stood near the window, her back to him, looking out at the vast city below. Her posture was regal, but something in her eyes seemed distant. She had already retreated into herself, just as she had at the wedding. Ezra stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had never been in a room like this before, and the sight of Elendra, his wife, his queen, was almost surreal. He was married to an alien queen, and yet all he could think about was the war that had ended because of this arrangement. He hated her, or at least he told himself that he did. How could he not? The Verax had caused so much pain, so much destruction. He wanted to hate her, but something inside him made him hesitate. Elendra turned slowly, her golden eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with tension that neither could break. "I hope this peace brings you some comfort," Elendra said, her voice soft but firm. Ezra nodded, though he felt anything but comfort. "I'm not here because I want to be," he said bluntly. "This is a political marriage, nothing more." "I know," Elendra replied, her gaze unwavering. "But perhaps we can make the best of it for the good of our people." Ezra clenched his fists at his sides, not wanting to show weakness. He couldn't let himself get close to her, couldn't let himself think that this was anything more than a means to an end. This was just the price of peace, the price of saving Earth. "I'm here to do my part," he said, his voice cold. "But don't expect me to treat this as anything more than a duty." Elendra's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "I don't expect anything from you," she replied. "We do what we must for the future." Ezra didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so long fighting the Veyracs, hating them with every fiber of his being. And now he was married to one. It didn't seem real, and yet here he was, standing in this strange, foreign palace, bound to the queen of the very species he had fought against. He wanted to leave, to return to Earth, to get away from this nightmare of a marriage. But he couldn't. Peace had been made, and he was the symbol of that peace. Days passed, and Ezra struggled to find his place. He wasn't a guest, but he wasn't truly a part of Elendra's world either. He moved through the palace, isolated from the other members of the royal court. Elendra was always busy with the affairs of state, and he was left to wander the palace, attempting to adjust to the strange new world he found himself in. His thoughts were never far from Earth, from the people he had lost, and from the war that had ended in such an unexpected way. And then one day Elendra approached him with a simple request. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice gentle. "It's important." Ezra raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "A part of my world," she replied. "A part of me." Reluctantly, Ezra followed her through the palace halls to a secluded garden at the back of the building. The space was quiet and serene, filled with strange plants that glowed faintly in the dim light. There was a small pond in the center, its surface smooth and reflective. Elendra gestured for him to sit beside her. "I've spent my life fighting to protect my people," she said quietly. "But now I'm learning that peace is harder to hold on to than war. I thought peace would be simple, but it's not. It's complicated." Ezra said nothing. He didn't know how to respond. Peace was supposed to be a victory, but it felt like a constant battle, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to fight. "I don't expect you to love me, Captain Vance," Elendra continued, her gaze distant. "But I want you to know that I never wanted this war. I only wanted peace." For the first time, Ezra saw something in her eyes that wasn't just the queen. It was the person behind the crown, a woman burdened by the weight of her decisions. He had never seen that before. It was a glimpse of vulnerability, something raw and real, and it made him question everything. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. There was nothing left to say. The war was over. The peace was in their hands. But for the first time, Ezra wasn't sure if that peace had truly been won. Ezra woke up to another day in the palace. The soft hum of the alien city outside drifted into his room, but he had stopped paying attention to the strange sounds. It had been days since the wedding, and the weight of the situation still pressed on him. He had hoped that by now he would feel more settled, more at peace with the idea of peace, but instead it felt like he was trapped in a dream he couldn't wake from. He rolled out of bed, the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows of his room. Everything in this palace felt so foreign. The bed, the chairs, the floors, they were all so different from what he knew. Even the air felt thicker, tinged with an unfamiliar smell of alien plants and perfumes. The walls, adorned with strange symbols and carvings, seemed to mock his discomfort, reminding him that he was nothing more than a pawn in a game he didn't understand. Ezra dressed in the simple clothes that had been provided to him, still feeling awkward in them. He missed his old uniform, the one that had been a symbol of his service, his duty. But here, in this palace, no one cared about his past. Here he was just another man married to an alien queen. And that was what troubled him the most. The marriage wasn't real. He hadn't chosen it. It wasn't based on love, and it certainly wasn't something he wanted. But now he was stuck. Stepping out of his room, he was greeted by one of the palace servants, a tall, thin figure who bowed deeply before him. "Good morning, Captain Vance," the servant said in a soft voice, eyes lowered in respect. Ezra simply nodded. The words Captain Vance still felt strange coming from anyone else's mouth. He wasn't a captain anymore, not here. And even though the war was technically over, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting something. The war had ended, but there were new battles to face, ones that were harder to see. He walked through the palace, its quiet halls echoing with his footsteps. It was a beautiful place, but it felt empty. There were no other soldiers, no commanders, no fellow humans. Just Elendra's people, her court, her advisors, her servants, all aliens, all different, and all of them staring at him as if he was an intruder. As he approached the main hall, he spotted Elendra. She was standing near the large window, her back to him, looking out at the sprawling city below. She seemed distant, her golden eyes lost in thought. Ezra felt a pang in his chest. He didn't want to feel anything for her, but it was hard not to. She had been kind to him since their wedding. She had treated him with respect, even though he had done nothing to deserve it. She had shown him the palace, introduced him to the members of her court, and spoken to him with a calm authority that made it clear she was not just a queen in title, but in action as well. But Ezra could see the cracks in the facade. He could see the moments when her mask slipped, when she would look at him with something more than politeness, something that hinted at a deeper emotion. And that was what scared him the most. He wasn't ready for that. He wasn't ready to feel anything for her. The marriage had been a political necessity, nothing more. "Captain Vance," Elendra said without turning around. Her voice was soft but firm. "Please join me." Ezra hesitated before stepping closer. "You don't have to keep calling me that," he said, trying to keep the discomfort out of his voice. "We're married now. Ezra will do." Elendra turned, her gaze meeting his with a faint smile. "As you wish, Ezra." She looked at him for a moment, as if measuring him, and then motioned for him to sit at the large table in the center of the room. There were papers spread out before her, documents, maps, reports, the work of a queen. It was clear that she had not been idle in the days following the wedding. She had a kingdom to rule, and the peace they had brokered was fragile. "We must prepare for the next steps," she said, gesturing to the papers. "The war may be over, but the rebuilding has only just begun. There are agreements to be made, resources to be allocated, and tensions to manage. Our people are still wary of each other." Ezra sat across from her, studying her carefully. He had never imagined that a queen, especially an alien queen, would have such a weight on her shoulders. He had thought of her as just another figurehead, a person with power but little substance. But now, seeing her focused on the work before her, Ezra was beginning to understand just how wrong he had been. "You can't do this alone," Ezra said, his voice softer than he intended. "I may not be part of your world, but I've seen what it takes to lead. You'll need help." Elendra looked up from the documents, her golden eyes locking with his. "And you would offer your help?" she asked, her tone both amused and surprised. Ezra nodded. "If you need me, I'll be here." Elendra considered his words for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "I suppose I've misjudged you, Ezra. I thought you would be resistant to this peace, to our arrangement, but perhaps you are more adaptable than I gave you credit for." Ezra didn't know how to respond. He wasn't here because he wanted to be. He was here because peace had been forced on him, because he had been made part of something bigger than himself. But now, as he sat across from the queen, something inside him began to shift. Maybe it was the warmth in her smile, or the way she had acknowledged his offer of help. Whatever it was, it made him feel like he wasn't completely alone in this strange place. "I didn't want this," Ezra said quietly, almost as if confessing. "But now that I'm here, I think I might be starting to understand." Elendra's smile faded, and for a moment her expression turned serious. "You do not have to understand right away, Ezra. I do not expect you to. This marriage, this peace, it is as new to you as it is to me. But it is a beginning, a chance for something different." She stood up, moving to the window once more. "We are not so different. You and I, both of us, were forced into this situation. Both of us want what is best for our people. And both of us are struggling to figure out what comes next." Ezra stood as well, moving to stand beside her. He looked out at the city below, the lights flickering like stars in the distance. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for certain: his life had changed. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, Elendra was a part of that change. "I didn't expect any of this," he said softly. "I didn't expect you." Elendra glanced at him, her eyes full of understanding. "And I didn't expect you, but perhaps that is the point. We are here now together, and whatever happens, we must face it as one." Ezra didn't know what the future held, but he knew that, for better or worse, he had no choice but to face it. The war was over, but a new kind of battle was just beginning. One that was far more personal than anything he had ever faced before. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, Elendra was no longer just the alien queen. She was someone he would have to reckon with. Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him had changed. The palace, once a foreign place filled with strange customs and unfamiliar faces, was beginning to feel more like home. It wasn't because he was growing comfortable with the surroundings. He wasn't. But because Elendra had started to make him feel like he wasn't just a tool for peace, but a person with his own worth. They had spent several days together since their conversation, and although the tension between them had not fully dissipated, it was clear that something had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding now. Elendra was still the queen, commanding, intelligent, and distant at times, But when they were alone, she was different, more approachable, even kind. Ezra couldn't deny that there were moments when her presence made his heart race. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, with her golden eyes that seemed to see straight through him. But it wasn't just her looks that affected him. It was the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, and the way she cared for her people. He hadn't expected to admire her, let alone feel something deeper for her. It made him angry to feel these emotions because it made him question everything he had believed about the war, about the peace treaty, and about his role in all of it. The morning sun had barely risen when Ezra found himself walking the palace gardens, trying to clear his mind. The flowers that bloomed here were unlike anything he had ever seen, some glowing softly in the early light, others swaying in a rhythm that seemed almost choreographed by the breeze. The tranquility of the place was almost enough to ease his mind, but he couldn't escape the thoughts that kept swirling in his head. He had told Elendra that he didn't expect the peace to be easy, and yet it was harder than he could have imagined. The peace was fragile, held together by threads that could snap at any moment. The people of Earth were still distrustful of the Veyrax, and many of Elendra's own subjects saw the marriage as an abomination, an insult to their queen and to their culture. Ezra wasn't sure what to believe anymore. He had fought for Earth, given everything for his people. He had lost so much, his comrades, his home, and now he was married to the very race that had caused all that pain. It didn't feel real. It felt like a cruel joke. And yet, every time he looked at Elendra, he felt a pull, an undeniable connection that he couldn't explain. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Elendra approaching. She was dressed in her usual regal attire, her hair flowing behind her like a river of silver. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught his attention. It was the way she moved, the grace with which she held herself. Even now, when everything between them was still new and uncertain, she seemed so sure of herself, so confident in her place in the world. "You seem lost in thought," Elendra said, her voice calm but observant. Ezra smiled faintly, trying to hide the frustration he felt. "Just trying to make sense of everything." She stopped in front of him, her golden eyes meeting his with a softness he hadn't expected. "It's difficult, I know," she said quietly, "but sometimes we must learn to embrace the unknown." Ezra let out a breath, looking down at the ground for a moment. "I don't know if I can." Elendra's expression softened further, and she took a step closer, her presence calming in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. "You're not alone in this, Ezra. We're both in uncharted territory." The words felt heavier than they should have. He wanted to push her away, to remind her that this was all forced on him, but something in her eyes stopped him. There was a sincerity there, something genuine that he hadn't seen before. He had always believed that power, especially in someone like her, was a mask for something darker, but now he wasn't so sure. "I'm not sure I can do this," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't ask for this, I didn't want any of this." Elendra's gaze never wavered. "Neither did I," she said softly, "but sometimes we don't get to choose our path. We can only walk it the best we can." Ezra looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw not the queen, but the woman behind the crown. The woman who had been thrust into this role as much as he had. The woman who had lost her people, her world, and had been left to pick up the pieces. He had always seen her as a symbol of power, of something cold and unfeeling, but now he saw the burden she carried. The weight of the war, the weight of her people's expectations. And he realized that he, too, had been carrying a burden all this time. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but rather filled with an understanding they had both been too afraid to acknowledge. They were both trapped in this situation, but they didn't have to face it alone. Finally, Ezra broke the silence. "What happens now?" Elendra gave him a small, almost sad smile. "We move forward, together if you're willing." Ezra took a deep breath, unsure of what to say. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave everything behind and go back to the life he knew. But that was no longer an option. Earth was far away and the war was over. This was his reality now, whether he liked it or not. "I'll try," he said, his voice steady. Elendra nodded, her eyes meeting his with a depth of emotion that made his heart skip a beat. "That's all I ask." They stood in the garden for a while longer, neither of them speaking, but both lost in their own thoughts. The peace that had been established between their two worlds felt fragile, as if it could break at any moment. But in that moment, as they stood side by side, Ezra felt something shift within him. It wasn't love, not yet at least, But it was the beginning of something real, something he hadn't expected. Later that day, Ezra was called to a meeting with Elendra's advisors. They discussed the rebuilding process, the integration of their two societies, and the challenges they would face in the coming months. It was all business, necessary but cold. Ezra found himself zoning out, his mind still preoccupied with his conversation with Elendra. Her words echoed in his mind, and for the first time he began to think that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth fighting for in this new peace. After the meeting, Elendra found him again, this time in one of the palace's many hallways. She didn't say anything right away, simply standing next to him as if waiting for him to speak. Ezra turned to her. "Do you ever think about what we're doing?" he asked quietly. "About what happens after all this? The war's over, but it feels like it's just the beginning of something else." Elendra looked at him thoughtfully. "Every day," she said, "but I believe it's a beginning worth having." Ezra wasn't sure if he agreed, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't ready to give up yet. Whatever this was, this strange, uneasy alliance, it was far from over. And maybe, just maybe, it was worth the fight. The days following Ezra's quiet promise to try had passed by quickly. He wasn't sure if that meant he was moving forward or simply accepting what was happening around him, but each day was a step he had to take. The palace, once cold and intimidating, was beginning to feel more familiar, though no less overwhelming. Elendra, too, had changed, and each time they spoke, there was a deeper understanding between them, a mutual respect slowly blossoming. However, things were not so simple for the rest of the galaxy. The peace treaty they had forged, while celebrated by some, had many enemies. Both Earth and Veyrak factions still harbored resentment, and whispers of rebellion began to spread, with calls to end the peace and tear apart the fragile union that had been so carefully constructed. Ezra's duty had become clearer as the days went on. As part of the marriage arrangement, he was expected to assist in the integration of Earth's and Veyrak's society. This involved attending meetings with representatives from both sides, discussing trade agreements, resource allocation, and efforts to rebuild the war-torn regions. These talks were difficult at best, as trust was still an issue, and both sides feared the other's motives. Despite his growing attachment to Elendra, Ezra still found himself in a difficult position. He was a symbol of peace between the two races, but he was also a soldier, someone who had once fought against the Veyraks with everything he had. Now he had to play the role of a peacemaker, something that didn't come easily. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting with Earth's diplomats, Ezra found himself wandering the halls of the palace. He was angry, frustrated. Nothing seemed to be moving forward. The politicians and leaders were stuck in their old ways, too afraid to take real steps toward true integration. The humans didn't trust the Veyraks, and the Veyraks didn't trust the humans. Even Elendra's best efforts to mediate were met with resistance. Ezra knew something had to change, but he wasn't sure how to make it happen. He had never been a negotiator, and he was far from a diplomat. His job had always been about fighting, not talking. But now, talking was all he had. He wasn't surprised when he found Elendra waiting for him in the quiet courtyard. She was standing near a fountain, her back turned to him, staring at the water that shimmered in the soft light of the setting sun. For a moment, he simply watched her, his mind filled with thoughts he couldn't quite express. She had become a constant in his life, something he had not expected but found himself needing. He couldn't deny that there was a connection between them, one that went beyond the political marriage they had forged. "You're troubled," Elendra said, her voice cutting through the silence. Ezra nodded, walking toward her. "I don't think this peace is going to last," he said quietly. "The talks, the agreements, nothing is moving. We're stuck, and every day it feels like we're slipping further away from true unity." Elendra turned to face him, her golden eyes searching his face. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too, but we can't give up, Ezra. We can't let the fear and anger of the past hold us back. It's going to take time, but we have to keep pushing forward, for the sake of both our peoples." Ezra looked at her, his chest tightening. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I'm just one man. I can't change everything." "You're not alone," Elendra replied. "And you don't have to do this alone. I'm with you. I've always been with you." Her words, simple and genuine, hit him harder than he had expected. They were standing closer now, the space between them almost gone. For the first time in days, Ezra felt his walls begin to crumble. Elendra's presence had a way of making him feel both grounded and lost at the same time. I'm trying, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But it's hard, Elendra. I've seen so much loss. And now I'm here in a marriage that's supposed to bring peace, and I don't know if it's enough. She stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. I understand, she said softly. The weight of everything is heavy, but we have to believe that what we're doing is right. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future, together. For a moment, there was only silence between them, a silence that felt comforting rather than awkward. It wasn't the silence of two strangers, but the silence of two people who understood each other in ways no one else could. Ezra looked down at their joined hands, and then back up at Elendra. He saw the determination in her eyes, the same strength that had led her to become the queen of the Verax. It was the same strength that had driven her to broker this peace in the first place. And now, for the first time, Ezra began to see her as more than just the queen. She was someone who was trying just as he was, someone who had her own fears, her own burdens. He didn't know where their relationship was going or what the future held for them, but in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He had Elendra by his side, and that was something worth fighting for. The next few days were full of tension. As the discussions about peace and cooperation continued, the pressure from both sides increased. There were riots in the streets, protests calling for the dissolution of the peace treaty, and some factions of both the human and Verac forces still refused to accept the idea of unity. Every day felt like a struggle, and Ezra felt the weight of it all on his shoulders. But through it all, Elendra never wavered. She remained calm and resolute, always finding a way to keep the peace, to ensure that the treaty remained intact. And every time Ezra saw her face, he found himself drawn to her even more. She was not just a queen to him anymore. She was someone who understood him, who shared in his struggles, someone who had become a vital part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, after another long day of negotiations, Elendra and Ezra found themselves alone in her chambers. The day had been particularly hard, with more protests and more resistance to the peace. Ezra felt defeated, tired, and frustrated. He didn't know how much more of this he could take. But as he entered the room, Elendra was waiting for him, her expression soft but determined. I know it's hard, she said quietly, her voice soothing in the otherwise quiet room. But we can't give up, not now, not when we're so close. Ezra sighed, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. I don't know if I have the strength left to keep going. Elendra walked toward him, her hand reaching for his. Then let me help you. We're in this together. We always will be. For a moment, Ezra hesitated. But then, without thinking, he pulled her into a gentle embrace, wrapping his arms around her. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something other than the weight of responsibility. He felt the warmth of her body, the steadiness of her presence, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that peace, no matter how fragile, was possible. I don't know what the future holds, he whispered against her hair, but I'll fight for it, for you. Elendra tightened her arms around him, her voice soft. And I'll fight for you. In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The pressure, the tension, the uncertainty, it didn't go away, but it no longer felt as heavy. With Elendra by his side, Ezra knew that they could face whatever came next. Together, the tension in the palace had reached a boiling point. What was once a quiet whisper of resistance had now turned into full-blown defiance. Protests against the peace treaty were becoming more frequent, and some factions of both the human and Verac forces were openly calling for rebellion. The delicate balance that had been forged between Earth and the Verax was starting to crack, and Ezra could feel it. He could see it in Elendra's eyes every time they met. She was struggling to hold everything together, just as he was. Despite the growing unrest, Ezra knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when they were so close to something that could change everything. The peace had cost them so much blood, sweat, and sacrifice, and giving up would mean that all of it had been for nothing. Elendra had been working tirelessly, trying to keep the peace process intact. She had made compromises, reached out to leaders who didn't trust her, and even made sacrifices she wasn't sure she could afford. But the cracks were beginning to show. The human diplomats and military leaders were no longer speaking to her with respect. Some Verax had begun to question her authority. She was, in many ways, standing alone. And Ezra, he was the human face of the peace, but his loyalty was being questioned on both sides. The humans saw him as a traitor, and the Verax considered him a symbol of submission. Every day, he felt more and more like he was walking on a tightrope, with no safety net beneath him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it up. One evening, after another long day of failed talks and heated arguments, Ezra found himself walking alone through the palace. His mind was racing, filled with frustration, fear, and a sense of hopelessness. He didn't know how much longer they could keep pretending that everything was fine. The war had ended, yes, but in its place had come a new battle, one that he wasn't sure they could win. He found himself in the garden again, the place where he and Elendra had shared quiet moments in the past. The soft sound of the water from the fountain calmed him slightly, but it didn't take away the weight of everything pressing on his shoulders. He stood there for a while, trying to find some clarity, but all he could think about was the uncertainty that loomed ahead. Ezra! He turned to see Elendra approaching. She looked tired, her usual composure slipping slightly. She had never been one to show weakness, but Ezra could see it in her eyes. She was just as tired, just as uncertain as he was. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, coming to stand beside him. "I don't know," he admitted, "just thinking." She nodded, her gaze following his as they both stared at the fountain. "It's hard, isn't it?" she said after a moment. "This peace, it feels like we're so close yet so far." Ezra looked at her, his heart aching. He had never expected to be in this position, to be standing beside an alien queen, trying to save the peace they had forged. He had never imagined that the war would end like this, with him standing at the side of the enemy, working together to rebuild what had been destroyed. "It is," he said, his voice quiet. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up for all of this." Elendra turned to him, her eyes softening. "I didn't either," she said, her voice low. "But we have to keep trying. We can't let the fear and anger take over." "I know it's hard, Ezra. I know you're struggling with this, and I'm not asking you to forget everything you've been through. But if we give up now, everything we've fought for will be lost." He knew she was right. They couldn't give up. But it was hard. Every day felt like a new challenge, a new hurdle they had to jump over. They were both trying to rebuild something that had been shattered, and it wasn't easy. "I'm just so tired," Ezra admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I feel like I'm fighting a battle that can never be won." Elendra reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "We're in this together, Ezra. And no matter how difficult it gets, we have to keep moving forward, for our people, for the future." Ezra looked at her, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. She was right. They were in this together, and together they could face whatever came next. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while he felt a glimmer of hope. "I don't know what to do next," he said quietly. "But I'm willing to try. I'll fight for this peace. I'll fight for you." Elendra smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "And I'll fight for you," she said softly. For a moment they simply stood there, side by side, the weight of the world on their shoulders, but somehow, in that moment, feeling lighter than they had in days. The next few weeks passed in a blur. The protests continued, and the resistance to the peace treaty grew stronger. But Ezra and Elendra refused to back down. Together, they continued to push forward, despite the odds against them. They met with diplomats, spoke to the people, and did everything they could to keep the peace alive. It wasn't easy, but they had each other, and that was enough. One day, after a particularly difficult meeting, Ezra found himself standing outside, looking out over the palace grounds. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally. But as he stood there, watching the sunset, he felt something shift within him. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time, a sense of purpose. He had spent so much time questioning everything, so much time doubting himself, but now he knew. He knew why he had to keep fighting, not just for the peace, but for Elendra. She had shown him what it meant to be strong in the face of adversity, to stand up for what was right, even when it felt impossible. He wasn't sure where their journey would take them, but he knew one thing for certain: he would walk beside her every step of the way. Later that evening, as they sat together in her chambers, Elendra looked at him with a quiet intensity. "You've come a long way," she said softly. "I can see it. I can see how much you've changed." Ezra smiled faintly. "I've had a good teacher." Elendra's smile was soft, almost wistful. "We've both had a lot to learn." Ezra nodded, his hand reaching out to gently take hers. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay by your side." Elendra looked at him, her eyes full of something Ezra couldn't quite name. But he didn't need to. He knew what it meant. "And I'll stay by yours." And so they continued their fight for peace, not as strangers bound by politics, but as two people who had found something real in the midst of the chaos. They didn't know what the future held, but together they would face it, one step at a time.